So, traditional Jewish, Christian, or Muslim. To understand atheist and agnostic as well as...
Hi, Preston.
Hi, Katie. What's wrong?
We have a sad episode today.
It's a little rough for sure.
Are you gonna...
Welcome, everybody.
Oh. I didn't know that's what you were doing.
No, I have no idea.
I thought you were going to give us more of a soft open.
I got nothing.
All right. Well, welcome to the Holy Watermelon Podcast. Speaking of rough, that was a rough soft opening.
Yeah, a little bit. We might have to make some edits.
They can live with it.
Sure.
Our topic today piggybacks off of last episode a little bit.
A little bit.
It's kind of how we
kind of had a flavoring allusion to what's coming ahead.
Wow.
Yeah.
My palate is so excited. It's not actually. Today, trigger warning, we are talking about religious trauma. Oh.
Yeah. So an awful lot of society seems to agree that religion is good, or at least benign for the most part.
Fair.
But broad strokes like that get you in trouble. There's an awful lot within religion that has caused some serious damage over the years. And so we're going to talk about religious trauma.
Color me shocked. Sorry, that's already being insensitive.
So we've already talked before about how some religious groups really lean into authoritarianism. Some people call them cults or danger religions.
Or danger cults.
Yeah.
To separate from regular cults.
For sure. And they do damage in pretty obvious ways that we've talked about. But now we want to explore some of the more subtle or more common issues found in mainstream religious societies.
Journeyfree.org defines religious trauma syndrome. And I should clarify. So religious trauma syndrome, from my understanding, isn't like an official mental illness. Like you'd find PTSD in like psychologist books, but they are starting to identify it as a separate entity. Anyway.
Yeah, it's a thing that psychologists and therapists are talking about, but it's not in all of the books of accepted brain stuff.
Exactly. So again, from journeyfree.org, religious trauma syndrome is the condition experienced by people who are struggling with leaving an authoritarian dogmatic religion and coping with the damage of indoctrination. They may be going through the shattering of a personally meaningful faith and or breaking away from a controlling community and lifestyle. RTS is a function of both the chronic abuses of harmful religion and the impact of severing one's connection with one's faith. Right, so those are two important parts that, there's the doctrinal pieces and the community pieces, but also removing yourself most likely from all your friends and family.
Yeah, so we're going to explore each of those points with some depth and see how
it happens and signs of it, I guess.
Yeah. And the symptoms of religious trauma are pretty similar to that of complex PTSD. In fact, a lot of people who are studying religious trauma are having a hard time distinguishing one from the other. And some are just saying, no, it is PTSD. It just happens to be triggered by this particular thing. And that's not terribly unfair, but because of what we're talking about as the Holy Watermelon, we're looking at the religious aspects, whether you want to distinguish it from PTSD or not. The reason it comes to be is specific and kind of unique.
Well, and I think with religious trauma syndrome, as opposed to complex PTSD, is that it's very systemic and very preventable. And I'm not saying that there aren't pieces of PTSD that aren't systemic or preventable, but when you literally have international organizations perpetuating what we're about to talk about, it makes it an interesting case. I guess that's as diplomatic as I can put it.
Yeah, the The scholarly classification is tricky, and it's probably going to be tricky for a while, but the fact of the matter is it's a real thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
But the symptoms are pretty obvious an awful lot of the time. And so we're going to talk about those. What's the first one on our list, Katie?
The first one on our list is confusing thoughts and the reduced ability to think clearly. And these are also from journeyfree.org.
So that's, how do I want to word this question?
I mean, that's like step one in any indoctrination, is that you don't trust your own thoughts.
Yeah, if you're trying to free yourself from any system of thought that has been imposed on you for any real long period of time, breaking free of that is going to be problematic and is going to cause confusion.
And especially when, and this isn't targeted at one specific religion and won't be very sensitive, Preston, so you can slap my hand, but when it actively, most religions discourage you to think critically.
An awful lot of them. I can't say for sure most of them, being more than half. That's not a thing I know.
I would say of
but an awful lot of them
easily
do
the
discourage.
Abrahamic faiths.
Pretty often. Mainstream Christianity has an awful lot that actively discourage critical thought, though there's a few that are more or less within the mainstream that encourage it. The Catholic Church has a weird relationship with critical thought that there's, like when it comes to science and evolution, for example, they're totally on board with the scientific community. There's a lot of other places where things get tricky and cause bad relationships.
Wow. Just talking around it. Love it.
We're going to get into some specifics as we go on.
So number 2 is negative beliefs about self, others, and the world. And this can take the form of dissociation, identity, confusion or crisis, depression, anxiety, grief, anger, feeling isolated, feeling lost or directionless. One thing I read in a lot of the interviews that fall under this, there's really a lot of like what surprised you when you left. Mm-hmm. And one thing I saw come up a lot is that these people who left their religious group were so surprised that atheists and agnostics could live happy, fulfilling lives. So that falls under to the negative thoughts about others, is that you think if they don't have, and this is just what comes up in research, and I think it's because they're the most vocal group, but ex-Christians or ex-evangelicals, didn't realize that if you didn't have Jesus in your life, you could be a happy, healthy, kind, good person.
Way too many Christians I have heard speak over the pulpit saying that there's no way that any non-Christian could ever lead a fulfilling life, which, like, that's absolute garbage. I don't know how they can believe that. I don't know how you can go through your life and associate with your neighbors and believe that.
I think, and I think I talked about this in our atheist episode, is that I think people just assume they're Christian.
Yeah, that is definitely reality for a lot of people. I don't know. It's weird.
I think if we picked someone that didn't listen to the podcast and asked them what my religion was, they'd probably pick Christian.
Probably.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you were just to ask a stranger, hey, what religion do you think I subscribe to?
Or even someone who knows me well enough to kind of know my personality and work ethic and some of that stuff, but not know me so well that we've talked about this or they've listened to the podcast. I would get.
Probably.
I'd put money on it.
That's not an unfair assumption.
There you go. Anything do you want to add to that point before I move on?
No, let's keep going.
We have a lot to cover this episode.
Yeah, we do.
So. Number 3 is a lack of pleasure or interest in things you used to enjoy. I think this is just a pretty general trauma response.
Yeah.
I kind of love this one. Number 4 is feeling behind the times with cultural happenings.
For sure. If you've gone to church for years and they say you're not allowed to read Harry Potter because it's of the devil, and then you go out into the open world and half of the people around you love Harry Potter.
Is a wizard. No,
you're out of touch.
Or not having, groups that aren't allowed to have TVs or watch TVs and go on the internet.
Mm-hmm. Oh,
that's huge.
So about 14 years ago, I was hanging out with some of my friends, and their dad brought home this guy who had left a Hutterite colony. And he ended up going back later on. But
Because he couldn't handle it.
right, which is a problem that we'll explain a little more as we go through here. But his first night away, we watched Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace with him.
Did he
And
lose his mind?
so to make it worse, somebody told him that this was a actual
No, that's
representation
mean. Okay,
of
that's
the
mean.
world outside of his little bubble.
Okay, that's mean.
That this is a thing that is actually happening somewhere. This isn't computer generated effects. Space travel. I don't believe that he left the house believing that this is true, but in the moments immediately following this declaration, you can't feel anything other than completely out of touch with the world around you.
I've just finished reading Unorthodox by Deborah Feldman, and it's a biography about her leaving the ultra-Orthodox Jewish community in Brooklyn, New York. And she talks about she's older, and when I mean older, I mean like 19. And she goes to her first movie, and she like couldn't wrap her head around, like she couldn't understand that it was fake or real, or like who these people were, that they were playing other people. And I think it was Mystic River she talks about. And to this day, she's like, I have a really weird relationship with Mystic River because I watched it in a context where it wasn't a movie. And where, like, so you look on screen and you go, oh, who's in Sean Penn's in Mystic River, I think. And you go, oh, that's Sean Penn. But like, she can't, even to this day, like, she doesn't see him as Sean Penn because she watched it like it was a documentary. Like, yeah. Mind blown.
Yeah, that's a problem.
Yeah. I think after that she figured out what movies were, but
the first time, that's a rough day. And that messes with you for a while.
And Mystic River's not like an easy movie to just, it's not Wall-E,
Sure.
It's I think it's a pretty heavy movie.
Mm-hmm.
It's not High School Musical, You're really like jumping into the deep end.
Sure. And there's a few other symptoms of PTSD that overlap here too. Nightmares are common, flashbacks for sure, general emotional difficulty, panic attacks, suicidal ideation, sexual dysfunction, substance abuse, and sometimes even extreme violence. It's making these transitions can be really rough on people.
Yeah.
And that all comes from the trauma that you experience within these religious groups that broadly get categorized as good or at the very least benign.
Absolutely. And I mean, part of the problem is that, especially the ones that would cause religious trauma, because obviously not all religious groups would cause religious trauma, is that you're supposed to be isolated. Mm-hmm. So it'd be really hard to even know that you needed help, let alone being able to ask for help.
Yeah, well, the worst of the groups rely on you being isolated for their success. Yeah. So that does make things a lot worse. Mm-hmm. And so, of course, these problems appear more often in authoritarian and dogmatic groups than anywhere else. Not only in the cults that we've previously addressed as the danger religions, but they're really quite common in Islamic groups and even more common in Christian groups specifically.
Well, and then again, I'll toss in Orthodox Judaism, ultra-Orthodox Judaism.
For sure.
Because I just read that great book. Highly recommend.
Yeah.
But it doesn't look too different from ultra-conservative, insert Abrahamic religion.
Right. The biggest issues that tend to cause lasting religious trauma are toxic environments that focus on doctrines of you're not good enough or you're not good at all and you're not safe and you can never be safe.
Ugh.
I've seen churches do this, and I don't know how you stand at the pulpit and say something like that and think that that's an okay thing to say.
There is, I should show it to you when we are done recording. There's I think it was a Refinery 29 little mini documentary on the Christian mainstream music industry. And they interview like ex-musicians, and they basically say like it got really hard to sing about how shitty you are as a person all the time.
Mm-hmm. For sure.
So anyway,
The world of Christian music is a weird world for sure.
maybe that'll be an episode.
Yeah, maybe. It's weird because there's some Christian music that I really enjoy, and worship music is not the worst Christian music that there is out there, but it is the hardest to listen to because it's so repetitive.
A fun Katie fact. I really enjoy religious Christmas carols.
Sure.
Like if you made me pick between like a secular Santa Claus Christmas carol and then something about Jesus, I'd pick something about Jesus.
Okay.
They're just better songs.
All right.
Anyway, I know, and that always surprises people. I'm like, I can appreciate music.
Right. Yeah, so it's frustrating because phrases like "you're not good enough" can be useful in some situations as part of a constructive and helpful dialogue, but I mean that's a can, not a is. They're usually not okay, especially when they're repeated too often.
I was going to say, especially when it's like drilled into you constantly.
Yeah, then you're gonna have a bad time. And things like original sin and other mainstream Christian doctrines like that, the nature of hell, which actually has a lot of variety depending on who you're talking to about it, they're frequently used to reinforce very traumatizing ideas.
We'll get into that. But yeah, I definitely know kids that were scared of hell.
Yeah. That an awful lot of parents, whether or not their priests agree with them, have used hell to terrify their children. And that's not okay.
You're just asking for religious trauma.
Yeah, really. So there's a lot of ways that abuse fails to be discouraged in religious communities, and I want to address that a little bit too.
But I want to be sassy. You don't say.
One, there's always pressure to preserve traditions, that any deviation or modification is treated as disrespect, and any sort of progress is seen as a spit in the face to those ancient righteous people that people like to look up to when they talk about the people who have gone before them.
Yes, because it hasn't changed at all in 2,000 years.
Right. It's nonsense. Traditions are constantly evolving, and we like to hope that they're improving. And in an awful lot of situations, they are. Our society in general is a lot safer than it was 1,000 years ago, for example. But to say that any sort of change or any questioning of why this tradition is upheld, people suck.
Well, and I mean, it doesn't even make sense in the context of, I mean, simply adapt or die.
Right.
And I think, we'll see. Obviously, this will take time, but it's already starting where churches that don't accept LGBTQ plus people are not going to last.
And we're seeing a lot of them dwindle and die.
This is a huge problem, and we'll talk in more detail about this later, but a huge problem in the Catholic Church with their sex abuse scandal. It's like adapt or die, right? Figure it out. They had a third party look into all the sex abuse, and their findings were like, let the priests get married. Like that was literally the result. It was like, let them not be celibate.
Right.
And marry. And they're like, no, we can't do that. But people leave the Catholic Church in droves because they don't want their children diddled.
Right. Well, it's so weird because the Ukrainian Catholic Communion still look up to the Pope as the head of their church there, but they're slightly separate because they're the Ukrainian Catholics, that they've joined the Catholic Communion after establishing their own traditions. Ukrainian Catholic priests can marry.
Ukrainian Orthodox can marry too.
Well,
I think any Orthodox
is a lot more reasonable.
Which is funny because it has the word Orthodox in it.
Right.
So progressive, the Orthodox Church.
Well, the trick is they never implemented the law to begin with, as far as I'm aware, where they said priests can't marry.
Which is probably why the Ukrainian Catholic clergy are allowed
to
do it, because they go, but he's allowed to get married across the street. And so they'd be like, fine, I guess so.
They established the tradition and then joined the Catholic Communion.
Good.
And so the Catholic Communion never stopped them from doing it, which is really odd. But so we do have Catholic priests who have wives and still work in their communities. And it's just super obvious that it's working.
Oh, dear. Anyway, so that's my commentary on that point.
And so this sort of absolutist devotion to tradition often leads to abuse of any person who points out any reason for change. Some people are shunned and excommunicated, which there's an instant trauma maker right there.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Some people suffer physical disciplinary action.
Potentially an instant trauma maker.
Yeah, pretty high risk. Some people are forced into remedial indoctrination. That's going to cause some problems.
Yeah.
And some people are lucky enough to only be permanently blacklisted from opportunities to serve in their community.
Oh, boy.
Yeah, which doesn't help build trust. Yeah, it's a problem. But abuse is not only used to ensure obedience to the dead. We also have a whole bunch of systems in place that perpetuate simpler abuses. Some will simply use your differing opinion as evidence that you lack faith. And in the worst situations, this has led to sexual abuse and murder. Yeah, which I don't know how you make that leap in your mind intellectually or emotionally, but it's happening. It's hitting the news. Some will use your lack of commitment to the group as evidence of other sins. And so, of course, that will lead to fewer opportunities to serve, which just that builds a terrible spiral where you're then obviously less committed to the group because you're not serving. And then people assume greater sins, and then it just gets worse and worse.
Yeah, that falls into the you're not good enough or the you're not trying hard enough to whatever be holy or whatever.
Yeah. It's being an active part of a community is not supposed to be this hard.
No, and I think, and I guess we'll probably get more specific on it, but any commitment to any community is supposed to ebb and flow.
Yeah.
Right? Sometimes you're really into it, and then sometimes other stuff gets in the way. And in some of the stories I read, people would say that like they couldn't give anymore, and when they had to step back and take a break, then they were guilt tripped into, well, like what's happened to your faith or whatever. But you can only give so much to anything. And yeah, to be a healthy human being, you should have interests outside of your religion, I presume. And yeah, so in some moments of your life, you'll be more dedicated than others.
Financial offerings, especially in Christian traditions, though certainly not exclusively, are directly connected to promised blessings. And unfortunately, this usually leads to manipulating gullible poor people into donating more and more money and staying poor with the promise of some farcical windfall in the future.
Yeah, there's a few groups we see this in a lot.
Send us your seed money.
I was going to say, prosperity gospel churches. Scientology is obviously a big one for this. Yeah.
Yeah.
Keep you too poor and too busy to realize what's happening.
Right. Oh. Next one I've got on my list. Multi-level marketing schemes. There's so often pressure to join multi-level marketing schemes within religious communities, especially Christian churches, as far as I've been able to see, though I'm sure it shows up other places too. And if you express any distrust in a company, you're accused of not trusting the people that you see every week and end up being pushed away by the crowd that did end up buying in, which just seems ridiculous to me that there's that much pressure. And there is, I've seen it, but it's ridiculous because how can your tiny business survive when you flood the market with competing providers?
Yeah. You need to tap new markets.
Right?
Yeah. You would want to be the only one in your church that sells the product. If you're the only one at church that sells Tupperware, you make him bank.
But you know what the real problem is? pyramid schemes rely
Rely
on
on a
making money.
downline. Okay, then you can have 2 downlines at your church, but that's it.
You got to have more downlines.
I know, but
And then you're
at
not even
church,
selling the product anymore. You're just making money off of,
other people selling the product.
yeah. Well, not just other people selling your product, other people buying your product and hoping to sell, and they probably won't.
Probably.
Because that's how those MLM schemes really work. It's not okay. And so if you're in a hard financial position and turn down one of these opportunities, you're shamed or shunned for being lazy. I can't get work. Oh, join my company and be a salesman for me. No, bro, that's not cool. Oh, well, you're so lazy. That's not okay.
I promise you that's not the problem.
Right? But an awful lot of people get treated that way. And then you lose trust in your community, and then things get worse. It's a problem.
How you doing? How you holding up?
There's so many complaints about churches, and I know they're all valid. I've seen them, but it's draining.
I mean, maybe we'll wrap this up on what people, congregants, clergy, churches can do to fix
Oh, we
this.
have to. We have to end it on a positive.
Okay. This is going to be a long hour, folks.
Try not to. We've also got way too many people that are actively discouraging their neighbors from getting the medical and professional help they need. Why don't you just believe more? God is going to take care of you. Or God would have prevented this if you just had faith.
Or sometimes this one I think is almost even worse.
Mm-hmm.
This is all part of God's plan. You were meant to get sick.
Which
your child was meant to die.
I don't know how people can go through saying that and believing it.
I think even the act of saying it is traumatizing.
God planned for you to suffer.
Right?
That's not cool.
Because obviously whatever you're going through is traumatic. So to have someone come back at you basically saying you deserve it is just re-traumatizing.
Well, there's a difference between saying you deserve it and God planned this for you.
That's true.
However, in an awful lot of people's minds, if you genuinely believe in God, they are the same thing. Yeah. And that's harsh.
Gross.
Yeah. There's loads of people with full-time jobs working for churches or other religious societies. And they're underpaid, and the excuse is that you're serving God and you should do your duty to volunteer every waking hour and your needs will be met. Don't you worry. God takes care of the sparrows and the dandelions. He'll take care of you too. And then it turns out your needs aren't being met.
God also put like doctors on earth and like labor laws on earth. And
gave us brains.
He has brains. He instilled the minimum wage because if he's all knowing and all seeing and good, then someone was divinely inspired to make a minimum wage.
Yeah, if you believe God controls everything, then you have to believe that God supports different minimum wages in all jurisdictions. So
specific. He must have so much free time.
Right.
That was how very atheistic of you. I liked it. Am I rubbing off
I
on
don't
you?
believe in the same God that every other Christian believes in, but to say that every other Christian believes in the same God between each other is also ridiculous.
That sounds like a problem within Christianity.
We've got a huge variety. It's a spectrum, you know?
Okay. Take a shot.
Yeah. There's way too many people who are either deliberately or sometimes even just carelessly taking unreasonable advantage of people because of their faith. And this causes problems in pretty much every case. It's especially seen when people in authority belittle their subordinates, but there's an awful lot of people who just like to say, hey, I'm better than you because I have this much faith. I saw you put less money in the pass around bowl than I did, so my faith is better, so I'm better than you. People suck.
That's what this entire episode is about.
Right? And sometimes you'll even see people use another person's lack of faith to excuse their own deviant behavior, which I don't know how you can take that logical step. Like, I know how it sounds when people say it, but I don't know how you can get there intellectually yourself.
Give us an example.
Oh, he's so awful. He's a homosexual. So I'm going to step outside the boundaries of what I know my faith teaches and beat him with a rod. I mean, if you've read the book, which as a faithful person you're supposed to have done, you'll know that's not okay. But it happens literally every day on this planet.
It's really sad, Preston.
It is really sad. It makes me mad sometimes. But that's the world we live in. A slightly weirder example that's less extreme. I remember one time when I was a kid, I didn't want to go to church. One day it's like, I don't really feel like it today. And my mom was so mad. She's like, no, if you're going to really honor the Sabbath, you're going to go to church. And if you're not, then you're going to work all day, which is an absolute contradiction, because the same law that says you're going to honor the Sabbath also says you will not permit anybody within your gates to work on the Sabbath. And that's a contradiction.
But she got some free child labor out of you.
No, I ended up going to church.
Oh. I would have picked the labor.
But she was happy to act unnecessarily hypocritical to get what she wanted out of the situation. And that sucked.
Yeah.
But that's actually not even weird in Christian communities.
I'd say probably in any Abrahamic community.
Probably.
If you can work it, I mean, how do you think the priests get away with it?
Yeah, as long as you get what you want, you're going to be all right.
I mean, what?
Yeah, it's really frustrating. But that's the world that we have built for ourselves.
Yeah.
And we have the power and the opportunity to change that world if we want to make that choice.
So now we're going to have even more fun and break down the different traumas, I guess, in a little bit more detail.
Yeah.
So we're going to start with the actual doctrine that causes trauma. And before doing this episode, this is basically my entire understanding of religious trauma, that something in the doctrine was so disturbing, it causes PTSD. I didn't organize this, just saying it.
Okay, that's fine. I just feel like I've kind of monopolized the voice. So I'm just going to let you do your thing.
Oh, wow. So I have a quote by Laura Anderson, who is the co-founder of the Religious Trauma Institute. And she says, we're talking about, in a way, brainwashing. Doctrines taught over and over and over with consequences that are eternal and terrifying. So deep-rooted fears of hell can cause PTSD.
Absolutely. If I don't do as I'm told, I'm going to burn in a lake of fire forever. No, that's going to mess with some people for sure.
Yeah. So while we have joked about the movie A Thief in the Night, I think we've talked about in our Revelation episode. It's from the 70s. It's super hokey. I kind of want to do a watch party on Discord one day. But I've read about multiple people that obviously in the 70s saw it for the first time that were like deeply disturbed by it, including Brian's own sister. And so I found a quote. I think I found this on Reddit, but this lady says, a few days or weeks after the film viewing, I came into the house and Mom wasn't there. I stood there screaming in terror. When I stopped screaming, I began making my plan. Who my Christian neighbors were, whose house to break into to get money and food. I was 12 years old and I was preparing for Armageddon alone. So she had thought her mom had been raptured. She was probably at the grocery store. But that's immediately what her 12-year-old brain went to. is that the rapture had happened and she had been left behind, which is also a book series targeted towards children. And I can see why that would be deeply traumatizing. If you
Absolutely.
actually thought you weren't good enough to be slurped up into heaven and that it's impending.
Mm-hmm.
So that's pretty scary.
Yeah, it's a mess.
So the stories shared on the forum all kind of have similar theses. Is that even though people have left their faith and maybe they don't believe in hell or purity culture anymore, the physical and mental ramifications, even if they can logically say they don't believe it anymore, it's like imprinted itself on their minds and bodies. They
still
can't
affects them.
actually, they can logically say, I don't believe in heaven or hell, but they can still wake up at night terrified that they're going to go to hell.
Yeah, it'll still come in nightmares, things like that. It's pretty messed up. And PTSD is right there.
No joke. Individuals are taught from early childhood that they're empty of goodness, strength, or wisdom and must rely on God for anything of value. So this goes back to our first point of doubting your own brain and your own critical thoughts.
Mm-hmm. If it's not good, it's not from God. If it's not from God, it's not good. Which is not an okay way to go about your daily life.
No, and then you get into this, and the next section is purity culture, but then you're being told by perhaps a church leader that it is from God, and it's really, really bad.
Mm-hmm.
It's really bad.
Yeah.
And they don't know what to think or do anymore.
An awful lot of churches, I've seen people teaching that if you don't vote for a specific political candidate, there's no escape from eternal torment. It's mostly people using their faith to defend the far right, especially in places where the liberals approve or accept the legality of abortion and the conservatives don't. Then if you even give a liberal a time of day, you're supporting them so much that you deserve to go to hell. I don't know how you can go through life like that.
No. I didn't put this in the notes, but I've obviously been thinking about it in our research, and I didn't do anything specifically on this. But, and I've talked about this on our Discord, kids and the Passion of the Christ. Like, I've seen videos of, like, you know, pretty graphic Easter plays, and there's like 5-year-olds in the audience.
Mm-hmm.
That feels traumatizing to me.
Watching somebody get whipped and tortured
Yes.
in real life, yeah.
Okay.
I don't know how that would not be traumatizing.
I mean, we just don't often talk about it in the scope of religious trauma.
Right.
We usually talk about the rapture or hell. And I mean, I don't know if you have any insights on why we do or don't talk about that. Maybe it's because it's, you know, it happened. It was a thing that happened. Whereas like people are waiting for the rapture and waiting for hell.
So
you see what I'm saying in the difference there?
This imagery is usually like if you want to take a child to a passion play and they see whipping and torture, usually it's all about the Jesus suffered this so you don't have to. But the but is always included. If you're not good and do what you're supposed to do, his suffering doesn't matter for you. You have to suffer the same kind of torture forever in hell. So it gets tied directly into the hell fears.
Okay. So maybe that's why it's not talked about as its own entity.
Right.
Anyway.
I think so.
All right. So Bible's graphic.
It
not
really
for
is.
kids.
Most of the Bible is stuff that if your kid can understand it, then it's acceptable for most of it. But an awful lot of it is way too graphic for kids.
So the next traumatizing thing we're going to talk about is purity culture.
Purity culture has messed up a lot of people.
Absolutely. I think it's still messing up people, and even in non-religious ways.
Yeah, for sure.
We were definitely taught that abstinence was the only guaranteed form of birth control.
If you've read the Bible, it's not.
Poor Mary. She was so abstinent.
Right? And then, bam, baby. But, I mean, the huge amount of emphasis we put on abstinence is actually really problematic for literally any rape victim.
Yes. And I mean, I say purity culture is very much detrimental to women. I don't know how
Absolutely.
much men are affected by it, but
Not nearly as much.
no.
Well, okay. They're not affected as much in a traumatic way.
Right.
Typically, when men really adopt the purity culture, they end up being more abusive.
To women.
Yes. Not to each other, but
no, I know.
women.
So it just always comes back to the poor women.
Yeah.
But there's like a bunch of really gross analogies, like who would want a piece of used chewing gum? That's a favorite.
I've heard it in church more than once, and the next time it happens, somebody's going to get hurt.
Really?
For real.
Like you're gonna toss
I
fists.
might throw hands.
Can I come?
Sure.
I
mean, I don't know when it's going to happen, but the next time I hear the gum analogy in church, I'm going to throw hands, very likely.
Oh man, I'm so excited. I am rubbing off on you. Which is gross because it has no bearing to your worth.
Right?
Healthy.
Well, the thing that bothers me, in addition to it being a really gross analogy, is that it's absolutely contrary to the doctrine of Christ.
He liked Mary Magdalene.
I
Who
mean,
was a whore.
there's unfortunately no evidence that that's the case.
What? That he liked her, that she was a whore.
That she was a whore. That's a popular Catholic doctrine that actually has no basis in any reliable source.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Dang. That wrecks Jesus Christ Superstar for
A
me.
little bit.
Well, anyway.
But even if she was, does it matter who she was before she changed her life around?
Do sex workers need to change their life around?
Well, this one became a faithful disciple of Christ.
Okay.
Without any
I'll give her an A+.
projection onto anybody else,
She did.
Mary Magdalene became a faithful disciple of Christ.
I'd actually say, so there's obviously like, I mean, just treating women like they're objects. And this goes for both men and women, but not teaching kids sex ed, in my mind, is literal child abuse.
Yeah.
And maybe in the moment it's not traumatizing because they don't know, but one day they're going to have sex and that's going to be traumatizing.
Yeah, I remember on an episode of 1,000 Ways to Die, this super conservative couple, like they'd never kissed before
Is it going to
they
be
got
the
married.
story I'm going to tell you? Okay, 1,000 Ways to Die, tell me.
They'd never kissed before they got married.
Okay.
So they couldn't have sex the night they got married because that was way too extreme.
Absolutely.
It took them months to try.
Uh-huh.
Because they just couldn't get over those boundaries that they had put up in their heads that sex is bad and
yeah.
not healthy and you just shouldn't be doing it. But eventually they got around and figured it out and finally understood what they needed to do. And they both died of heart attacks
Oh.
because it was so much stress and the blood pressure didn't help. They died. I don't know if there's any truth to it. I feel like more than half of the deaths on 1,000 Ways to Die are fake, even though they tell you they're real. But the fact that there are an awful lot of people who can relate to that level of trauma around sex is a serious real life problem.
Absolutely, because you're told forever that it's bad, and then one day, thanks to a ring and signing a paper, it's supposed to be good.
Yeah.
This is a terrible story. Some people might want to fast forward it. Anyway, it comes from the book Unorthodox, which I was like, I read it in like a day. Anyway, if you can't tell, I'm on a kick. I'm on a kick. Anyway, and so this didn't happen to the author Deborah, but she was talking to one of her friends. And again, super conservative, orthodox, same thing. Sex is bad. No, they didn't even learn about sex. She didn't even know she had a vagina.
That's not a healthy way to go through life.
So she didn't know she had a vagina. She talks about it in the book. And anyway, so she and her friend were talking about sex. And this friend, they didn't know what hole to put it in. So they had anal sex and he ruptured her anus and she almost bled to death.
Wow.
Right? I shouldn't say that like I'm excited, but like
That's
traumatizing.
yeah, that's long-term trauma right there.
Absolutely.
Wow.
So everyone should go to sex ed, and it shouldn't even be your parents. We've had this conversation.
Yeah, no, it's we've done the sex ed with parents thing for thousands of years. We've come up with a better way.
Yeah, you don't have to do that anymore.
Take advantage of the newer, better way.
And I guess the other piece I want to talk about, eventually we'll do a full episode on purity culture because I think it warrants one. But the other big piece is that for women, your body doesn't belong to you. It belongs to your dad and your father. That's the same thing. It belongs to your dad and your husband and then to God. So you have no body autonomy.
Yep. And it's weird how many women buy into this and vote to preserve this every couple of years. The fact that it's even a legal issue that's still being debated blows my mind.
You know what? Someone posted on Facebook today about the tree that owns itself.
Mm-hmm.
Have you heard about this?
Mm-hmm.
Anyway.
And it's always somebody comments, this tree has more personal autonomy than most women.
I know. I didn't comment on it because all the comments were like, oh, that's a really cool story. And but that is exactly where my mind went. I was like,
for sure.
This tree has more rights than most women.
Mm-hmm.
Because it can't be cut down.
Yep.
But there's a huge chunk of the United States where women can't get abortions.
Mm-hmm. Now, to be fair, nobody's going to give those same rights to another tree in the future.
I mean, that's fair. But like, why can we not revoke this tree's rights?
Because it has rights. You can never take away rights most of the time. Okay. It's not fair. People have definitely taken away rights, but it gets really tricky and it's actually kind of hard to do. But giving rights, we have so many people fighting against giving people rights. It's a mad world.
It is. And purity culture piggybacks nicely
into just the general religious
misogyny of religion.
Yeah. It's really frustrating. We have evidence of religious misogyny as far back as ancient Hellenism in good old Greece. Zeus is the worst. He'll rape anything with a pulse. The stories tell us many instances of this.
What about things without pulses? I feel like he even dabbled in some of that. No, I don't mean necrophilia. I mean inanimate objects.
I got nothing coming to mind, okay. But if you can think of something.
I can't, but he seems like the kind of guy that'd be like, ooh, a hole.
I mean, it's not incongruous with the Zeus that we know.
That's so far off.
And a weird side note on that is I still think it's super weird how much the Zeus from the Disney cartoons looks like Donald Trump.
I have to Google that now. I can't picture him off the top of my head.
It's not a perfect likeness because Zeus is muscular as hell, but
there are some political cartoons where right-wing cartoonists have made Trump muscular as hell, and it's real weird.
Yeah, I believe you. So in these old Greek stories where they talk about how men deal with the gods, because of course it was men, they taught that men existed as companions of the gods until Prometheus stole fire from the gods for mortal men. And so Zeus gave them Pandora. And after her, all of womankind. And her jar, not a box, as much as I love the pun that we've used that word for lately. Her jar contained all evil, and she is personally responsible for unleashing it on humanity. Because women are meant to be objects. And that's actually how that story goes about, is that they were meant to distract men from trying to achieve greater things.
And we're doing a good job.
I mean, maybe. Depends who you ask.
Not me. I'm not distracting anyone.
In Christianity, the Apostle Paul is very worried about more or less the same thing, that women are distractions and that men are falling victim to them as well as homosexual men.
How come you men can't control yourselves even a little bit?
That's a great question. And that's not a fair question, but it's a good one. An awful lot of men have great self-control. An awful lot are the most dangerous people you'll see in the world because they have no self-control.
Just stop putting it on the women. We're not
Yeah.
distractions. You're distracted.
Right? It's ridiculous. And a lot of people like to take opportunities to praise Paul for his position, saying that we need to suppress women and shame them instead of worrying about what Jesus said when he said, if you can't look at a girl without sinning, cut your own damn eyes out.
Can we preach that more often? Can you teach? How old are your Sunday school boys?
The Sunday school I teach is for adults. So
Oh.
when
How, like what age though? Like young adults or like 40-year-olds? Any of them.
any adults.
Can you please
all
talk
ages.
about that on Sunday?
I don't think that it really can fit nicely into what I've got coming this
Okay,
Sunday,
fine,
but we'll see.
work it
When
in.
it can come up.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay.
I have done it before.
Okay.
And I've had people be very happy that I brought it up.
Oh, good. I'm happy. you
Usually
brought it.
women. No surprises there.
Can I just say, Brian and I had just started dating, but at your wedding,
hmm
I presume a huge portion of your guests were Mormon.
Half?
Half. Someone like full on checked me out with a child in his arms. And I was like, okay, guy.
Yeah, the one you were there for, I'd say probably about
Okay.
half.
I assumed it was like me and Lindsay were the only two that weren't. But, and Lindsay saw it too. She was like, did you just see that? I was like, I did.
That's unfortunate.
Yeah, anyway. So that guy needs to go to your Sunday
Yeah.
school class. I don't know if he was. Anyway.
In fact, looking at, there's, talking about a variety of religions here, Muhammad is even quoted as, when saying why women should cover up, it's because the men around us are rapists. So let's cover up the women instead of, beating the shit out of the men, maybe?
I like eunuchs.
Yeah, sure. I can appreciate their necessity in some instances.
If you're going to rape a lady, cut off your own balls.
Yeah. Usually when I think of eunuchs, I think of voluntary eunuchs, but
No.
no, as a disciplinary measure.
Castration.
Yeah. No, it makes perfect sense.
I think it would happen a lot less.
It's weird that it's
Even-
not more common, forced castration for criminals.
Even if it was like, I think you can do like a chemical castration where
Well,
you're
yeah.
not actually cutting off
Yeah.
the balls. You just make it so they can't get a boner anymore.
Yeah.
There'd be a lot fewer rapists, I think.
It doesn't mean they wouldn't be touching other people,
That's
but
true.
the way they touch them would change. Not
But
necessarily.
I wonder
for the
even just
better.
having the ramifications of losing your penis, essentially. I don't know.
I don't know. This is a much broader
This is a
conversation.
big what
for
if
another day.
conversation. Yeah.
It's weird that instead of learning discipline, which clearly men need, and not just men, let's be real, there are some trashy women out there too, to add to the list of terrible, terrible men. But instead of learning discipline, it's easier to just make sure women are seen less often. And it naturally follows that if they're seen less often, they'll be seen as inferior because they're actively prevented from taking visible leadership roles, which is the world we live in today, where nobody thinks that a woman could be president of the United States because she's a woman, and women can't lead because we've just been telling them that for thousands of years. Nonsense.
I think it was the Trevor Noah show. One of his people went to a Trump rally and started interviewing people. This is like, I don't even know if this is before his first election. It must have, no, this is like pre-Biden. Anyway. And no, So I lied. This was before he went up against Hillary. And he asked a lady at the rally if Hillary could be president. She said no, she couldn't because she's a woman, which I think he already thought was weird because it was a woman saying it. He was like, well, why not? He's like, well, she said women are too emotional. He's like, a woman has never started a war, right?
Never, ever.
Never, ever. He's like, every war. Oh, yeah. She's like, women are too emotional. She'd start a war or something. He's like, every war's been started by a man.
Yeah.
It has.
People rely very often on terrible arguments. And that's one of them.
And I say that, but I think Queen Elizabeth I invaded Spain, or did they start that with her? She fought a war with Spain. I just don't know who instigated it. Anyway, that's completely irrelevant to this conversation.
No pair of women has ever started a war. Women can fight against men. That's obviously a thing. But I don't think there's ever been...
No, they would talk it out.
Right.
Sorry.
It's crazy. This world we live in is nuts.
It's a mad world.
But in the Quran, Muhammad goes a little bit further than even Paul did and actually advises men to beat their disobedient womenfolk. Of course, there's some scholars who say, no, we choose to translate that differently. Most people translating the Quran say, yeah, no, they're talking about you need to beat your disobedient womenfolk.
There's some, and I don't know if this is just like specific to a group, but there are like trad wife Christian groups that are totally into corporal punishment for both wife and kids. I don't know if that's in the Bible or if that's a terrible interpretation, or like Gothard from the Duggars.
Mm-hmm.
He's all into he's fine with corporal punishment. So
I don't remember any corporal punishment being advocated against wives in the Bible. You've actually read the Torah more recently than I have. Did anything jump out at you in that subject?
No.
I don't think so. Yeah, it's just crazy. Scientology you had brought up earlier. L. Ron Hubbard, the founder of Scientology, actually said, a society in which women are taught anything but the management of a family, the care of men, and the creation of future generation is a society which is on its way out. Obviously, this man did not have a healthy relationship with women at any point in his life.
He like abandoned his wife and kid because he just didn't like them anymore, I think. He was not successful at the marriage thing, so do not take advice from L. Ron Hubbard.
Right. An awful lot of, I don't want to say Islam is responsible for this, but an awful lot of nations that are happy to describe themselves as theocratic Islamic states have a really hard time allowing women to go to school. Mm-hmm. And there's no solid cause for this in the Quran or even the Hadiths that I'm aware of, but it's a thing that keeps happening.
Well, there's that, and then I would say the homeschool system, predominantly in the States, but I'm sure it happens here in Canada, that they stay in school probably, but they get a completely different curriculum that doesn't set them up for life. Mm-hmm. I don't even think... so the New Duggars on TLC is a show called Welcome to Plathville, and they're also quiverful, but they don't have quite as many. And
Quiver half full.
Quiver half full. And my favorite daughter, her name's Mariah, because she totally left the fold. But yeah, she says like the schooling they did doesn't even qualify them for their GEDs. So although she finished grade 12, air quotes, she has no high school diploma.
That
so,
sucks.
While she's not, she's homeschooled, so being physically pulled out of school is the wrong phrase to use here. But while she's still going to school, unlike in some of these Islamic nations, she as good as well was, Yeah,
she's being deprived of a proper education.
Exactly, yeah. That is a much more eloquent way to put it than I put it. Thank you.
Yeah, and it's not just any one religion. It's an awful lot of religions are seeing this as their reality, and it's a huge problem.
I think, again, especially in you know, in here in Canada, we have the public school system and the Catholic school system.
Mm-hmm.
And I think just from the size of the Catholic school system, it's a little more monitored. But when you get some of these privatized religious schools, that's where some big gaps in a proper education start to happen. Obviously, these parents think that the proper education is a religious education, but that does not set them up for university. And I don't know why I'm on it this time, because the entire book was about it, but unorthodox, same thing. She got a great Jewish Hebrew education, but she, you know, wasn't prepared for university.
Right.
So she was prepared to make babies and cook for her husband.
Yeah, there's a real problem where, broadly speaking, which, you know, I say don't do, but I do
Well, we're doing it, yeah.
occasionally. Broadly speaking, people in charge, people with power, are not going to give you the education that you need to realize that change needs to come into effect. A lot of people like to say this to talk down about public education, and there's some truth to it, but it's way worse in private schools, especially religious schools. And any religious organization who sets up a homeschooling program for you is definitely going to lean into that too.
Well, I mean, yeah, public school is not perfect, but at least you'll get the school of life, right?
Yeah.
And a little bit of the school of common sense, because you're just dealing with so many different types of people.
Mm-hmm.
You're not going to be blindsided when you turn on a TV for the first time.
Right. If you're homeschooled, you're very likely to hear all kinds of stereotypes about different groups of people, usually your minority groups. And if you're not exposed to them because you're homeschooled, you've got no contrary evidence, and you end up believing it because you've heard it so many times, because that's the agenda of who's schooling you. But in a big city with a diverse population, you're a lot less likely to have that problem where you start believing the stereotypes, because you have loads of evidence of people who fit the descriptor and don't fit the stereotype that's being shared.
We have a family member, I'm going to speak very vaguely, who occasionally says some pretty Islamophobic things, but they're from rural Alberta. And so often I'm like, have you even met a Muslim? Like, I don't think you know what you're saying.
Mm-hmm. I heard a little while ago this lady saying, talking about this time when she convinced the Muslims that they had been worshiping a moon god. You know, no, we were watching a movie together I shared with you. That's what it was. She was bragging in this video about her spoils of victory, teaching the Muslims that they had been worshiping a false moon god for ages. And it's just like, you don't know who the Muslims are. They don't worship a moon god at all. They worship the same God the Christians do.
So you've convinced them to not believe in your God. That's not good.
Right. It sounds kind of weird.
Yeah. And so, as we've digressed, our last point, which we've kind of talked around, is that many religions teach that men are above women in heterosexual relationships. And I think this is from the Religious Trauma Institute. If you feel that you have no choice other than being submissive to your husband or dominant to your wife, it might be time to reconsider the structure of your relationship.
Yeah.
Actually, here's a question for you.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you can answer it. Because we always hear about, purity culture and misogyny as it's toxic to women.
Mm-hmm.
Do men feel pressure to be dicks to their wives? You know what I mean? Like, if you're
Maybe. I never have felt pressure to be a dick to my wife, but I feel that...
You were kind of a dick earlier tonight.
But not with pressure. It's just being funny.
That's true.
But
he's lovely to his wife. Please don't add us.
She has plenty of opportunities for escape. But I don't think there's a lot of real pressure in any circles where I travel to be.
Yeah, You're the wrong person to ask.
Misogynist.
I should have done more. Now I'm just thinking about like if you were a really nice guy and really loved your wife and she wants to go to university and the pastor's going, well, you should put her back in your place. And you go, but I don't want to.
Yeah, we might throw hands.
Okay.
Well, probably not become violent, but I definitely have some pretty harsh words.
No,
for
I
that
just
pastor.
mean, is that happening to men?
Probably.
And sort of what extent that they feel pressured to be this hard ass husband when they don't want to be.
There have definitely been loads of men who have been called to bring their wives into line, for sure. And probably a lot of them, I can't say for sure most of them, but I would say with confidence, an awful lot of them have absolutely done as their pastor has told them to do because of that relationship of authority.
Gross.
Yeah, it is kind of gross.
Let's carry on with the grossness.
So the next bundle of things, we got people who are abused for variance of opinion. We got people who are abused for being born without a penis. And we've got people who are abused because of the color of their skin, which is nonsense. And there's an awful lot of layers why people are terrible to each other. Usually it's just a tribal mechanism that relies on encouraging the simple-minded to use only their eyes and not their brains to determine easy lines of separation. But people have very often been abused or simply neglected in their religious communities because of differences in ethnic origin. One of the first examples that comes to mind, having grown up in a community with an awful lot of Latter-day Saints, is Brigham Young. He decided that it made sense to ordain children to priesthood offices, including making his 11-year-old son an apostle, but decided to undo Joseph Smith's work and deny priesthood ordinations to anybody with even a drop of African blood in them.
So everyone, because you know where humans came from, right? Africa.
That's what the science is showing. Yeah, but that's good old Brigham Young, who had 66 wives. So you know how he felt about women too.
I saw a flow chart of Brigham Young's wives once.
Yeah.
It was terrible. Of how so obviously he was a polygamist.
Yeah.
But they don't like bigamy, right? Where women can have multiple husbands.
That's polyandry.
Oh, okay.
Bigamy is having two wives.
Oh, okay.
So he definitely liked bigamy.
He definitely liked bigamy.
Also thought,
polyandry,
why have two when you can have 66?
He liked bigamy times 30. Sorry, polyandry. But he married other men's wives.
Yeah.
Well, there's so that is polyandry.
It is.
And then they show ages and who were sisters and who were mother and daughter, and it gets anyway.
Yeah, it's weird.
It is weird, but we're not talking about that. We're talking about racism.
Yeah, and so the way that Brigham Young related to Black people was not positive at all. And to be fair to Brigham Young and Joseph Smith and the early Latter-day Saint leaders, they were not alone in this idea that because all Black people were the children of Cain, who was, the evil of the sons of Adam, that all Black people were inferior. This is widely believed among most Christians in the 1800s. And the cause and effect there is definitely a huge problem.
Yes.
Has led to a lot of abuse and is not at all reasonable. And thankfully, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has reversed Brigham Young's policies on racism only about 50 years ago. Not soon enough, but it happened, so at least we got that. When prompted, most people will describe the physicality of their God as matching their own physical ideals, if not their own actual self-image. That's why Jesus is classically depicted as European when you look at most religious art, because the Europeans and the European artists didn't really have much of a model reference apart from Europeans. the same is true when you go to Korea. Jesus is going to look a little bit Korean. And you hear a lot about Black Jesus in the States and other parts of the world as well. But mostly where I've heard of Black Jesus in the States, it makes sense that you project, in the absence of a true model, yourself onto the God you worship. Back to the Korean Jesus, I think it's really important to state Jesus was way more Asian than any of my Filipino friends. And I will fight anyone who wants to contradict me on that.
You're just so aggressive tonight, Preston. I love it.
This topic of trauma, it makes me very uncomfortable.
Oh,
And
I mean, it should.
That if it makes you feel glee, you've got issues.
Yeah.
The Philippines are islands in the ocean. They're not part of continental Asia, but they are on the Eurasian tectonic plate. But they're not in Asia. The Middle East, including Jerusalem, is in continental Asia. So Jesus is Asian. That's the way it goes.
Okay. That's very semantical, but
Yeah.
I'll accept it.
You know what? I'm okay. If somebody wants to draw Korean Jesus and say this is the real Jesus, it is as accurate as saying British Jesus is the real Jesus. Because they're both on opposite ends of the continent from each other. Jerusalem's in the middle.
So it's some blend. Kidding. We know he was a brown or Arabic guy.
Arabic isn't a fair descriptor. The Arabians were a different nation, but I mean, when it comes to skin tone, yeah, people who have grown up surrounded by just white folks would definitely have a hard time distinguishing the two.
Well, that's where the word Caucasian comes from. Is Arabia. That's where the Caucasus Mountains are.
Yeah, but that's not the same thing.
I know, but when I put on a hijab, people are like, "Oh, are you Arabic?" No, people who are Arabic just have white skin.
I mean, not white, but pale.
Fair.
Like, fair compared to, say, the depths of Congo.
Or, I mean, even just other places you think of in the Middle East.
Yeah.
Anyway.
So unfortunately it's way too easy to step from my God has this skin color, because if your God has a body, you're not usually imagining him without skin. So that skin
I
is going to
just
have
did,
color.
and it's great.
Attack on Titan, here we come.
Yeah, right.
So it's not hard to go from my God has this skin color to anyone who doesn't have this skin color is inferior. And that's a huge problem, especially when you jump to the next step that an awful lot of people do, where if you have this inferior skin color, you clearly have a deficient spiritual potential, and that is evidenced by your skin color. That's not okay.
Well,
there's an awful lot of reasons why a lot of people have been hurt by religion.
mm-hmm.
And there's no reason for any of these things to still be part of our culture. But we have an awful lot of people who want to perpetuate these problems.
So to end on our hopefully positive note, how does it get fixed? What do people need to do?
One, we need to recognize trauma when it appears. And we need to acknowledge that trauma is a perfectly natural response to the repetition of doctrines of a violent, angry, all-powerful God who is dissatisfied with your race, your gender, your subculture, or the entirety of humanity. Teaching these things should probably stop. Trauma is perfectly natural response to repeated exposure to pastors who use threats of eternal damnation or demonic possession to maintain control of their flocks. That needs to stop. Any person who doesn't conform to strict rules of sexuality and gender expression are at greater risk. And we need to acknowledge that and maybe take better care of them, because they face extreme pressure to mask or change their identity, which also causes trauma.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely. Well, and we didn't even touch on conversion therapy, which I won't open that can of worms because we're well into this episode already. But absolutely, that's a huge part of it. Atheists don't do conversion therapy. Sorry.
No,
know.
are the atheist countries that actually really try and suppress religion, like Russia, for example, just kill their gays. No conversion therapy.
No.
China has a hard time. So we got a lot of countries that don't like gods and don't like gays.
There's like, well, I remember hearing a stat during Pride, only 28 countries that have legalized gay marriage out of like 198. That's terrible. Anyway,
It's a short list.
it is.
Leaving a religious group can add to religious trauma because these communities, as damaging as they are, also offer some measure of support to their members and sustain a worldview that brings personal stability and promises of safety. So leaving these groups means abandoning that support and is usually accompanied by greater anxiety and depression and actual trauma. Trauma is a real thing and it ruins lives.
Mm-hmm.
But therapy exists for religious trauma syndrome, much like PTSD, and there are loads of resources online to help connect you with the help that you might need. And it's important to know that religious trauma is a lot more common than you think it is. It's a real thing. A lot of people feel it to one degree or another, and you're not alone if you suffer from religious trauma. There's people you can reach out to.
I also feel like this is a disclaimer we probably should put at the beginning, but we're not therapists.
No, not at all.
Not even if you can't tell.
Like, as much as I want to point people in a specific direction to get help for religious trauma, I'm not even qualified to do that.
Right. Speak to your local mental health service provider.
Yeah. There's help out there. People will acknowledge your troubles and they will help.
Absolutely. Well, that was hard.
It was hard, but I think it's important to
Absolutely.
to share.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us. It's been a bit of a ride. We'll lighten things up a little bit next time.
You can find us on our Discord server if you want to continue the conversation. We are also on Patreon doing bonus episodes and early releases, and we have a really interesting interview coming up probably in a couple weeks from this episode. I'll just teaser it with a cult survivor. So ties a little bit into this, ties a little bit into our cult episode. And of course, so Patreon if you want to support and keep our podcast going. And our merch store on Spreadshirt. Every little penny we get helps us keep this podcast running.
Thank you so much.
Peace be with you.
By the late Middle Ages, the Christian prophecies had fulfilled itself.